hardness, darkness, Saturnian kind of. Lead is the heaviest, darkest metal, symbolizing the heavy, dark, leaden, depressive kind of consciousness that we can get into if we don't bring consciousness to bear on it. If we bring the fire of attention, the fire of awareness, the fire of life, perception, to this kind of consciousness, we raise it to the point where it's a reflective and conductive type of consciousness, as is gold. Very malleable, can be shaped into ornaments and artistic forms. And this is would be the analogy, the imagery for expressing the change of consciousness, the actual change of your mode of thinking, your mode of responding to the world, the mode in which you perceive the world. The yogic tradition is a little bit more separated from the physical world. But it works basically with the same kind of, it doesn't work so much with animal or plant, for example, plant substances, although some aspects of yoga do. For example, the tantric tradition in India does use plants and herbs and so forth as an adjunct to consciousness work, but more concentrating on the mental techniques, the meditational techniques of yoga, but the purpose being the same, being the contact with the inner world. And animals are used as symbols, of course. You have animals and the chakras and that kind of thing. In Taoism, it's interesting because there the yogic aspect of alchemy is much clearer. It's much more clearly spelled out that alchemy is also a yogic internal practice. So I would see yoga and alchemy as being the Indian and Chinese equivalent to what in Europe became the alchemical tradition. And which before, in the pre-literate, pre-technological, Neolithic and Paleolithic culture was shamanism. Shamanism, animism meaning that nature is alive. One other thing I wanted to say about alchemy is that Jung said, well, the alchemists were projecting the contents of their unconscious into matter. So they were looking at the processes going on in the retorts and having visions or hallucinations from that. They were really projecting their own internal dynamics into that. And what I've come to realize is that this is both true and not true in the sense that, yes, there is projection going on. You are projecting your own images that come out of your own ancestral inheritance into these processes that you're seeing. It's not, however, necessarily, it's not an unconscious projection, because the images that you're projecting are these mythic images that you've been taught, that you have learned from your teachers and from your books that you've read. The figures and the stories of the gods and the animals and so forth, the stories of the ancestors, which is what the mythology is, the story of our ancestors, are projected into these processes. It's a conscious, not an unconscious projection. And it's also, again, to remind you of this thing about the inner and the outer, it's not only a projection. Yes, there is projection, but there is also perception. Projection and perception are the two poles of the processes of our attention in relationship to the world. We constantly project images from within us. We project meaning from us. But we also can be and need to cultivate our receptivity, our ability to perceive or to apperceive, as some people say. Apperception is a sort of contextual perception where you get not only the thing there, but the whole context in which that thing is and how it relates to you, and the feelings and the associations that go along with it. That's a receptive process. And in this, there's an exquisite and poignant dance in the interplay between these projective and receptive, perceptive processes that we engage in all of our lives, because it's extremely easy to get stuck in one or the other mode. And getting stuck in one or the other mode is equally detrimental. Many psychics, for example, get stuck in the receptive mode. They're not able to make the discrimination between what's their own projection and what they're actually perceiving. And often they take on a lot of physical illnesses or psychic discontents and distress as a result of that. So, shamanism, alchemy, and yoga as traditional technologies of consciousness transformation, which allow us to be in greater access and communication with the other worlds of consciousness, which we exist around us. And you might say, somebody might raise the question, well, no, so what? Who cares? Why is it important that we have contact with these other worlds? Well, the reason for the importance basically is if the model that these other worlds exist, that we live in a multidimensional reality, is correct, then we're in deep shit trouble if we don't pay attention to the other worlds. Since all of the traditions, spiritual traditions, psychic, philosophical, religious traditions of all times, including shamanism, are unanimous in asserting this claim that our ordinary attention and consciousness is limited to this pathetic fragment of the possibility to be perceived. Like the Sufis say, we're like a man who lives on the ground floor of a 7-story mansion, having forgotten completely that there is the other 6 floors exist above him, which are larger and more spacious and greater and more beautiful and more interesting than the one that he lives in. And if a lot of your essential knowledge comes through to you from these other dimensions and you've lost contact with them, you don't even have the essential mechanisms for survival. See, psychic perception or extrasensory perception or clairvoyance and all these things that the shamans and the alchemists and the yogis talk about, they're not luxuries. They're not something we can indulge once we've taken care of survival. They evolved as adaptive evolutionary processes. And we've lost them to a large extent through atrophy. They've atrophied through misuse. It's very clear from anthropological research that primitive, pre-literate Aboriginal cultures have abilities that we call telepathy, clairvoyance, and so forth as a matter of course. They take it for granted, and they use it for survival. For example, think of a hunter tribe that's in Africa, the Bushmen and the Kalahari. This has been documented, that sends out a band of 6 hunters to track some animal, which they may be gone for 5 days. Okay, and they have to chase this big animal, such as a giraffe or a buffalo or whatever it may be, and bring it back. So they have no telephone, telegraph, they can't send runners. How are they going to stay in communication with the tribe? It's been documented that they are in communication with, telepathic communication with the tribe. The tribe can know that it's essential to their survival. They need to know when food is going to come, whether the people are okay. Clairvoyance, which simply means being able to see some of these more subtle phenomena that are normally kind of just disappearing into invisibility or imperceptibility, is equally essential. And your survival could hinge on it. So I see this, and we're not exactly in a position to say that our attitude has contributed to our survival. I mean, people do say that. People even say that nuclear deterrence has, the nuclear buildup has prevented nuclear war so far, hasn't it? We should congratulate ourselves how well we've done. And nobody who can look at the situation we're in can say that we are survivors. We've had to concentrate on the material world in order to survive. And therefore we can't indulge in luxuries such as these weird peoples of ancient cultures had the leisure to do, apparently. It's not the way it is. One interesting difference in the shamanic practice that's now from their role in traditional cultures, some of which of course still exist, is that in what you might call neo-shamanism is no longer the shamanism of the expert. This is one of the things I appreciate very much about what Michael Horner does. He's taken certain aspects of what he calls core shamanism, whether it's that or not, doesn't matter, certain techniques shared by shamanic cultures all over the world, and shown that Westerners, Anglo, white Westerners, middle class, with all the conditioning and brainwashing that the rationalistic, Newtonian, mechanistic world model has succeeded in impinging and putting on all of us, and can within a very short time have shamanic experiences, can open up doorways to these other worlds, can establish ally relationships, totemic relationships. They're not really totemic, because totemic means family, comes from the ancestry, and these are not. These are new. These are individual new. So everyone has the potential for becoming a shaman, becoming a practitioner of shamanism. It's no longer you need to go to the expert, the one person in the tribe who played that role. Because now we've evolved all kinds of other approaches for, of course, we still have experts, and it's okay to use experts, but on the other hand, what's much more important is that people, the actual you and me, all of us, anyone who cares about the world that we live in and would like to survive and would like to see this world pass on to our children and our grandchildren, it behooves us all to make use of every possible help, method, tool, technique, ally, spiritual, technological, as long as it helps us get there and accomplish this purpose. We'd be fools not to use it. I've recently come to understand also that there are different varieties of shamanic path, and this might help some of you think about how you might relate to that kind of path, and we can talk further about this afternoon too. Part of this came for me out of a distinction that's made in the Polynesian, Hawaiian shamanic complex between starting with the assumption that the shamanic path is one of the obtaining this otherwise inaccessible knowledge, usually not accessible knowledge, that they make a distinction between the path of the warrior and the path of the adventurer. And this is a very interesting distinction. The path of the warrior is a path that emphasizes impeccability and intense observation and attention. And it has a worldview that says the world is a dangerous place filled with malevolent forces, both ordinary human and spirit. And it's the task of the warrior to be able to defend himself, him or herself, at all times against these prevailing malevolent forces in the world around us. And therefore, the path of the warrior emphasizes this highly disciplined kind of practices. It tends to emphasize ordeal, self-infliction of pushing one's own limits for endurance or pain tolerance in order to extend one's limits of tolerance and steel oneself, as it were, for this ongoing combat. Basically, it's the impeccability, to me, consists, and Castaneda's books are good examples, are good descriptions of this path and this attitude. Impeccability, to me, consists in this sense of balance between what I've called the projective and the perceptive. Not just having the vision and sort of, oh yeah, vision, groovy, wow, taking it in. Many people have that attitude towards psychedelics. Just take it and wow. Impeccability means you look back. You don't just take it. You look and you try to discriminate and to discern between what are your own projections based on your own fears and fantasies and what is really going on there and what really is going on there. You need to be able to observe. You need to be able to catch the details. You need to be able to see through the surface in order to get the meaning that's being expressed by that surface of form. And that, to me, is impeccability. Impeccability means not just indulging and having the vision. It means observing the vision that you're shown in all states of consciousness. Now, the adventurer, the path of the adventurer is a little bit different. The adventurer actually needs to have the same impeccability and the same attention to observing and really attending to detail. However, he doesn't necessarily, and he agrees, the adventurer agrees, that the world is filled with malevolent forces, but that's not all. The adventurer, whom I actually prefer to call the explorer, so you think of it as adventurer-explorer, as a type of path, as an orientation, says, yes, okay, we need to be able to protect ourselves, so we'll learn the skills of the warrior. But on the other hand, reality is infinitely fluid, well, not infinitely, it's fluid and flexible within certain limits, and these limits can be extended and expanded. And the adventurer then rather tries to generate or co-create a picture of reality in which the potential for unfolding and for creative expression of everyone participating in it is maximized. So it's creating an environment, creating a setting, co-creating a space, a context, a reality in which each and every one of us humans and the animals and the plants and nature herself can be recognized as a community of equals and can have the right to unfold their own destiny. This is what the deep ecology movement is, how deep ecology connects into shamanism. Because deep ecology says every species of plant or animal and the environmental elements themselves have an equal right to live their life without having their integrity violated by one particular arrogant species. So, the adventurer, explorer, and the warrior consciousness share the emphasis on impeccability, on observation, on detail, on discipline to a certain extent, but the adventurer, explorer also emphasizes creativity more. The creative play to allow the unfolding of these created realities that maximize everyone's potential. So, the drawback of the warrior consciousness is that it has a tendency to become paranoid. Right? Because this kind of suspiciousness, the world is full of malevolent forces, shades very easily into paranoia. And when you think of warrior consciousness, not so much in the shamanic context, see, the shamanic warrior consciousness is conscious warrior attitude in relationship to the inner worlds, or the other worlds. Warriors, of course, exist in the ordinary world. And one kind of summary statement of the kind of mess that we're in right now is to say that the warrior consciousness on this planet has run amok. When you look at the governments of the world, both first, second, and third world countries, 99% of them are military cliques, military elites. The military-industrial complex has been in charge of, basically, they have access to the largest amount of resources, they have access to all the science and technology, they have access to the largest amount of money, they control, they dominate, they are parasitical on the economy. Because the military economy is not a life-sustaining economy. It's a life-destroying economy, which doesn't produce anything of value that sustains and supports life. Therefore, it's parasitical on the rest of the economy of people who grow food and live lives and try to, have babies and continue the life on this world. The difference between parasitism and symbiosis is very crucial. Symbiosis means mutual cooperative support of each other's evolutionary development. Parasitism is evolutionary development of one species or group or clan of another, at the expense of another. The colonial enterprise, the entire colonialism is a form of parasitism. That's why, we shouldn't be surprised when third world countries don't think of America as the land of opportunity as so much as the land of imperialist oppression and exploitation. The opportunity is not for them. So we are the ones that go in there, force them to change their agriculture over to doing monocultural things, which leads to, and force them to grow crops that they can sell for cash to make our hamburgers, to feed our cattle, and and therefore not be able to feed themselves and destroy the rainforest. You know, they're not doing that. They wouldn't come up with that as a mechanism of survival. It's a parasitism. It's for us. We consume all that stuff, and they are left with the waste matter. So this is one difference in which the shamanic revival, neo-shamanism, differs from the traditional role, is in its emphasis on each individual has the ability and the necessity and the right, certainly, to practice desirability of practicing it yourself. See for yourself. Find out for yourself. Go for yourself. Go and see. See what you can learn. And the other, to me, very well, this is not really a difference from before, but let me say something about what I think is the significance of this, and both Terence and Joan have already alluded to it. It's because the pre-literate shamanic aboriginal culture, primal cultures, have preserved this sort of shamanistic, animistic, pagan worldview, is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to study these cultures and to study our own past. Because we had that, our own ancestors had that kind of relationship to nature, which is completely different. They had a relationship to nature that was based on a sense of community with nature. This is one of the things Thomas Berry, the philosopher who's just come out with this extraordinary new book called Dreaming the Earth, emphasizes. The notion of community needs to be extended from the one that we usually are used to, the human community, to a community of humans with animals, with plants, with the natural elements of the environment, the earth itself, and with the spirits that dwell in it. This interconnectedness, interwovenness, which we have lost, which is exemplified in and emphasized in some scientific movements, particularly the Lovelock hypothesis, the Gaia hypothesis of Lovelock, which states that the world, apparently on scientific evidence alone, behaves like a living organism, like a living, breathing, giant organism, like a supercell. And the deep ecology movement, which says that ecology is not just a matter of preserving our resources, it's a matter of shifting out of an anthropocentric viewpoint, a human-centered viewpoint, into a biocentric viewpoint, in which life is at the center. And our task is to do everything we can to preserve and sustain life, and everything we can to avoid harming or to try to minimize the harm or the intrusion or the invasion or the destruction of anybody else's habitat. That the whole thing is interwoven in a unity. Now, Gaia, the notion of Gaia, the world by itself, there are certain limitations in that view too. For one thing, the Gaia hypothesis, as a scientific hypothesis, I think it's a major step forward in science. It's not quite the view of animism, because animism says that not only is the earth alive and all the different parts of the earth are alive, but these are sacred intelligences. So if you say the earth is alive, but you're still talking from within a mechanistic worldview, then it's alive in the way other animals and plants are alive, which is basically like a machine. Animals and plants, according to mechanistic biologies, are just self-reproducing machines. Self-regulating, self-reproducing machines. It's still a mechanistic worldview. We don't need to speculate about what Lovelock's views might be personally. They might be quite different from his scientific hypothesis. So it's okay to have the hypothesis, but I think the next step that still needs to be taken, that involves an integration of science and spirituality, which have also become separated, is to recognize that nature is not only alive, the earth is not only alive, but it's intelligent, we can communicate with it, and through direct means, and it's a sacred world. It is in fact interlinked with the existence and the viability of the earth itself. And when you think about it, you look at the spiritual, artistic expressions, the literature, the sacred texts, the symbols, the architecture, the sculptures, the paintings, and so forth. When you really see it, the role of nature, animals, plants, in all cultures, even, the religious traditions that are most separated from nature are, of course, the three Western monotheistic, patriarchal monotheistic religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. They have the worst record as far as a negative relationship to nature and earth, even although there are exceptions within its tradition, particularly in individual mystics. But the overall orthodox view of the system itself tends to be, in all three of those religions, rejecting of nature, fearful of nature, and seeing spirituality as really transcending nature. So, in Islam, you have this notion of the nafs, that are the animals. It's like the ego. The ego is symbolized by animals. And they are simultaneously our enemies that we have to get beyond. Well, see, this is a very different view than you would gain from the animistic religions, which has said, well, the animals are not our enemies. Neither the animals inside us nor the animals around us. The animals are our brothers and sisters, our relations, all our relations, both in the spirit form and in the real form. So we can cultivate this relationship with the spirit, the soul of the animal, as well as with animals that we actually might know of, flesh and blood and fur and four legs and wings. And the worldview that's emerging, this will be my last point now before we break, what I want to emphasize here is the recent realization that this animistic, shamanistic, pagan worldview that we're rediscovering, reconnecting with, and appreciating anew its value and its significance for our time, this significance becomes even more acute when you realize that in shamanism, they talk a lot about the importance of connecting with your ancestors. And in work that I've done individually and with groups, this is more and more becoming apparent that connection with the ancestors, connection with animals, spirits, guardian animals, and connection with ancestors, guardians, is an essential part of the process. And this is where the tie-in comes from psychology, psychotherapy into shamanism. Psychotherapy, you do a lot of work with your parents to clear up your relationship with your parents. And any negative charge that needs to happen before you can connect with your ancestors. The parents are your first ancestors. If you're not clear with them, you can't go any further back than them. Okay. And connection with the animals is actually really a part of that, because the animals are our ancestors. We are animals. We are descended from animals. So the primates, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, and the fish, that's our animal ancestry as orders of life, as kingdoms of life. But our human ancestry were hunter-gatherers for a couple of 100,000 years before they started farming and building cities with walls around them. A couple of 100,000 years of hunter-gathering, of wandering, of tribal existence with shamanic worldview, with a view of necessity of total sensory communication, maximal sensory communication, fluidity, discrimination with the natural world. These were our ancestors. And then you get into this realm of prehistory. Terence referred to the work of Ria and Isla, which in turn is based on the work of the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, whose major discovery over the last 20 years has been to uncover the goddess religion of old Europe, as she calls it. Europe before the invasions of the Indo-Europeans, the Indo-Aryans who came from Central Asia and invaded India from the north, the Mediterranean basin, and Western Europe in wave after wave after wave of invasion. These were nomadic horse people. They had domesticated the horse, and they had discovered how to make bronze weapons. And they started invading around 5000 BC, and wave after wave after wave, pushing and invading and preying on, really functioning as predators on the Neolithic cultures, farming cultures, which had already existed in those areas, in old Europe and around the whole Baltic region, the Mediterranean, including Crete, right up into northern, central Germany, southern, western Russia. That whole area, there were hundreds and hundreds of different cultures and language groups, in which the two chief features that are of significance are that these were goddess cultures that apparently did not have any kind of superior, inferior subordination relationship between the sexes. It was not a matriarchy, as Maria Gimbutas emphasizes, not a matriarchy, which means the mothers dominate, the mothers control, rather than the fathers. It was, as Riane Eisler suggested, a partnership society in which men and women had equal value and had clearly distinct roles. The chief divinity was female, and it was not a mother goddess. This is also important. The mother concept has been overemphasized, I think. Again, it's something we can talk more about later. It's the life-giving and death-giving goddess, because we are given life by nature, but we're also killed by nature. So this is not a mother. A mother doesn't kill you. Nature, as an intelligence, as a spirit, is what gives us life and what takes life. So there are these images, and there are images of this goddess figure in total unitive relationship with animals, the snake and the bird and various animals, toads, frogs, vultures, insects, bees, bears, bulls, sheep, goats, all the various animals. And no hierarchy within the society, other than possibly, there would be, in the buildings there would be a throne, but the throne was of the priestess, or the goddess would be in a central place. The goddess figurine would be in a central place. Second very important part is that in all these cultures, in these hundreds of things, there have never been found any weapons. There have never been found any fortifications. There is not the pattern that you find in later Sumerian, Babylonian, Greek, Egyptian, all these other cultures, which were all male god cultures, of a male king surrounded by all this wealth and ornaments and sometimes slaves also killed along with it, and weapons and inscriptions about the glorious militaristic deeds that the hero or the king has done. None of that. Instead, the dead, men and women and children equally, were buried right under the house where you eat and sleep, so that you have the connection with your ancestors right under your feet, under your body, where you live. You're reminded of them. And what does this mean? This means that, these people were our ancestors. The nomadic, patriarchal, warrior, sky god people were our ancestors, and the peaceful, egalitarian, goddess culture people were our ancestors, because of course they intermarried. They didn't just kill the others. They destroyed the religion, but they intermarried. They had children. Both of them are our ancestors. You may be familiar with Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, that habits of nature and culture get transmitted by repetition. That means the morphic field for a culture that's egalitarian between the sexes and that's peaceful exists within us. We have it within us. We have access to it in our psychic memory, whatever that may be, whatever form that may take. And not only that, the morphic field of that is much stronger than the morphic field of the militaristic, aggressive, dominating, patriarchal system that started around 4,000 to 3,000 years before Christ. Because those cultures go back to 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, right back into the Upper Paleolithic, where you first have little stone chips inscribed with goddess symbols. These were hunter-gatherer cultures, and then pastoralist cultures, and then farming cultures. They were not fighting cultures. The fighting comes in as a result of the invaders who came in, who took over, who plundered, basically, said, here, these people are growing their food. This is much better than having to gather it. Let's just take it. Who were able to do that because they sat up high on horses, who installed their gods. Of course, I'm not saying this is sort of the gross picture, but of course, they would intermarriage, and much of there is evidence for peaceful interactions also, and cultural assimilation and all of that. But the morphic field of that cultural way of life is stronger because longer in time, more people, longer period of time, than this other more new one. So that when I discovered that, when I learned this from Maria Gambuda's writings and talks, it did a change in my worldview and my paradigms that was as profound as the change that was induced when I first took LSD. Because up to that point, I'd always believed, history begins at Sumer and begins with bloodshed and warfare. And there's been bloodshed and warfare ever since. And in fact, then the biologists go along with that and say, well, we're descended from these aggressive animals. Aggression in nature raw and tooth and claw, eat or be eaten, the territorial imperative, 2001, bash the skull. That's it. We've always been that way. It's part of human nature. We can't change. Along comes this woman from Eastern Europe and says, no matriarchy, no weapons. For tens of thousands of years, 10 times, 20 times as long as our history that we'd previously thought was, this is our ancestry. This means these people are our ancestors. We know how to do that. We know how to live in an ecologically and peaceful, harmonious world. We've done it. So for that reason, I'm actually extremely hopeful, although I realize, as every one of you do, that our world situations, as you look at it today, is a total and unmitigated disaster. The apocalypse, the Armageddon, is already in full swing. It's not something that's going to happen next year or 25 years from now. It's happening now. All you need to do is read the papers, look at the television. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, war, famine, poverty, and destruction, they're all rampaging over the entire globe. Amnesty International just put out their more than 2/3 of all nation governments sanction torture as official government sanctioned practices. And the number is increasing, and the variety of torturing techniques being used and the numbers of people being used on is increasing. So there's no stretch of the imagination that can be called progress, but there are these very, very hopeful signs, and the locus of those signs is within the psyche of every single human individual, nowhere else. So, thank you for your attention.
Okay. The expectation for this afternoon is simply that we will attempt to address what concerns you have, to dialogue, to give people a chance to ask questions. It seems to me that often the most fertile part of these things is the dialogue part of it, because this is where then, instead of talking heads pontificating about whatever obsessions drive them personally, you have a chance to try and be the rudder of these public egos and steer them toward something interesting. And so the obligation is on you for the quality of rhetoric for that kind of a session. So I don't know how much was clear this morning, how much obscure, what issues it raises for people, but if someone would like to start off with a question, we would just make our way into it. Yes?
I asked it before, but you have to repeat it.
Yes. Before we go further, do you want people to take a microphone? How is this?
No, just speak.
Just keep
Speak clearly when you ask your question. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so here's the repeated question, and it it's to do with drugs, psychedelics. I know that you didn't necessarily recommend it, but you also didn't sound like you were against it. And the word has been coming up a few times.
Maybe I've overdone this even-handedness trip.
So my question is, what is there to know about drugs and brain damage? They have advertisements with a pen and an egg going in there and it's frying your brain. Every time you do it, you knock some brain cells out. And
well, the president's consort urges us to simply say no, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was Tim Leary the other night was wearing a T-shirt which said "Just Say No," K-N-O-W. See how close to the surface it is and how nearly the same thing? So that's the short and obvious answer. What is there to know about drugs? A huge amount. I mean, this is a department of human knowledge called pharmacology that is the life study of many people. In terms of this question of psychedelics and being a spiritual adventurer and coming to a place in your life where you say, then you have to make very clear choices. My own approach to this has been to give great force to tradition. That's why we're here talking about shamanically utilized plants, because they are plants with a history of human usage, thousands of years old. We already know that they do not cause tumors or madness or miscarriages, because if that were the case, they would have been pushed aside over millennia of usage. A private prejudice of my own that I urge on people is that the drugs they take should be as much like brain chemistry as possible, as non-invasive of the physical brain as possible. Fortunately and suggestively, the strongest of all hallucinogens are the ones most like ordinary brain chemistry. Another thing I think that's important is to be sort of pharmacologically monomaniacal. It's good to do, when you find out what works for you, just really do it into the ground rather than being someone who is always, this week it's 2CB and next week it's something else and then something else. It's much better, I think, if you find an ally who resonates with you to then utilize that. Ralph, you deal with all this. What do you...
A couple of things I would just say to that question. One is the first thing we all have to learn to do, I mean, we do it, but we also fall into the habit that our national culture has this concept of drug, D-R-U-G, the ad that you mentioned, and Nancy Reagan's slogan refer to drugs. And drugs is a very global category, as anyone knows, as soon as you start to think about it. And law enforcement legislation does not presently make any distinction between heroin, cocaine, marijuana, LSD, which couldn't be more different. They have completely opposite, sometimes, effects on the brain and nervous system. So that's one thing. Be discriminating about what drug you're talking about. And then another thing is to be aware of the fact that science and scientific information is a controlled process. And it's controlled by a government that has a basically fascist attitude towards foods and drugs. I've often thought the FDA could be an acronym for Fascist Drug Administration. We do have a fascist system within a larger outwardly democratic process, One of the things that's interesting to realize is that if you have a democracy, you can elect yourself into a fascism, which is what we've done.
Yes,
Because
Hitler.
fascism is the imposition of the opinions and beliefs of a minority on the majority.
It's the great danger of democracy, that it will become some kind of fascism of the majority.
And so the science, the fascist science, the medical pharmaceutical complex, which is next to the military-industrial complex, the largest and most powerful power group in our world, controls what goes out into the media in terms of scientific information. Not only control it, they manipulate it. It becomes more a matter of propaganda. So when you read accounts in newspapers and magazines that say such and such a scientist did a study that proved that MDMA lowers serotonin levels, whatever, and therefore damages brain cells, you can't read that and accept it as truth. You have to inform yourself, I would say, become more maniacal about pharmacology in a different sense than Terence. You have to train yourself and read the technical literature. If you really want to know what really goes on, you have to go into the original technical literature yourself, and you have to be able to discriminate between scientific experiments that are done for propaganda purposes and those which are genuine. And the media do not make that distinction, and drug enforcement doesn't make it, legislation doesn't make it. So, it's everyone's responsibility. If everyone's going to be their own shaman, it's also their own responsibility to know your drugs, know what your particular body can tolerate, as well as what's generally tolerable, or what's toxic, what has undesirable side effects, and be discriminating, use discernment, be impeccable about it, really, and take responsibility. As part of the whole medical thing, we don't take responsibility for our own health and well-being and getting better. We say, we still have that old the doctor knows best, and finally, I would say, along with Terence, what Terence was saying is, I think the use of the word drug is not a good word to use, period. I have tried to use it less and less and less, and even Hoffman said this years ago in relationship to psychedelics. But if you're talking about plants, visionary plants, sacred plants that have a long, long cultural history, as well as nutritional plants. It ties into the use of herbs rather than synthetic antibiotics or drugs in medicine. Herbal medicine is a huge underground medical system that's basically unrecognized and unacknowledged, just the way psychoactive plants and substances are recognized and unacknowledged. So by focusing on herbs and plants, natural substances, using synthetics only in those cases where something has been discovered that's not known otherwise in the plant or animal kingdom, would enable one to bypass much of that whole drug prohibition, paranoia, punitive complex that we live under in this society, which is very, very weird, because you have a fascist minority wishing to not only control certain substances, but actually control what you put into your body. That's going pretty far when you think about it. I mean, it's not that different from them telling you what you can eat and what you can't eat.
Eventually, you see, when we move beyond the current sort of dark age that we're living in, the idea that governments can tell you what drugs you can take will be as bizarre a notion as that governments can buy and sell human beings, or that there should be recognized a divine right of kings. It's actually a civil rights issue. And in the 19th century, people's argument against women's suffrage was that it would be unimaginable, that the world would be destroyed if you gave women the vote, that just madness would ensue. This is now the argument against allowing people to make these decisions about their bodies and their spiritual development. And yet science, which just relentlessly rolls forward, creating an endless cornucopia of steroids, hallucinogens, aphrodisiacs, memory enhancers, so forth and so on, is presenting us over and over again with this dilemma of how do we chemically manage ourselves in the kind of world we're living in. And I tried to indicate this morning, I think this is central to understanding what human beings are, that there is no such thing as a person without habitual relationships to plants. And it's tea, coffee, sugar, alcohol, and then a wider spectrum.
Cereals.
But yes, cereals. We embed ourselves, the very way in which we define good feeling and expression of the self is these various states of mind that we associate with our diet and our habit. People get up, the first thing in the morning most people do is choose the first drug of the day. Will it be tea? Will it be coffee? And so forth and so on. There's nothing wrong with this. We apparently, by our ability to collect, and it actually, it all goes back to our omnivorous diet. Most animals are not omnivores. Most animals have a food source, a spectrum of foods that they eat that is very narrow. But if you're an omnivore, if your habit is to eat everything and to test everything in the environment for protein, then you lay yourself open to exposure to vast numbers of mutagens, hallucinogens, tumor-inducing compounds, steroids, galactosides, poisons, all kinds of things. You accept that these things are impinging and selecting on the human genome. And very quickly, we have evolved into this very quirky kind of species that, as I said this morning, addicts to everything. I mean, it is the source of our great anguish and our great grandeur. We can addict to a piece of land and call it the homeland and defend it against all comers and slaughter with impunity anybody who gets near it and claim it after we've been away from it for 10,000 years as ours because we once were there. We can addict to another person. Anyone who's experienced heartbreak, real heartbreak, knows, this is like a withdrawal syndrome. I mean, bursting into tears every 20 minutes and not sleeping and vomiting every 3 hours. I mean, this person has a severe dependency which is being broken. In the same way, we ideologically enslave ourselves. So there is no percentage in denying this side of ourselves. What we have to do is manage it. Manage it in some way that serves, obviously, community-preserving purposes. And I think that the model is always tradition, that the traditional compounds, the traditional plants of shamanic usage are the ones that we are probably meant to use. They fit our hand the way a tool fits our hand. They were made for us. We co-evolved with these things. I was talking to Lester Grinspoon about this recently, and he said the way you can tell how long human beings have been using a drug is by how few side effects that drug has, because of course there is this mutual leveling of the stress of contact. Symbiosis has never been taken seriously by evolutionary biologists. Food as a mutagenic influence has never been taken seriously by human evolutionary theorists. And yet, obviously, that is what has driven us to such a rapid state of evolution, our willingness to expose ourselves to an extremely complex and shifting environment that was, in fact, the things we put into our bodies. Everything else stayed pretty much the same over long periods of time. So the question which the gentleman asked goes to the whole heart of the matter, to the fact that, we are living now in a kind of hysteria about drugs. Tim Leary said LSD was a compound capable of causing psychotic behavior in people who hadn't taken it. This can now be generalized. We see an entire society in a drug-induced frenzy, induced by drugs that they have never taken, you see.
One other thing I'd just like to add to that, too, on this theme of the relationship between foods and drugs and the human species, again, to hammer home this point, the argument has been made that every major civilization is founded on one of the 7 sacred grains. There are 7 sacred grains. The Chinese is built on rice. The European is built on wheat and rye. The American Indian civilization is based on corn, and so forth. And it's interesting to realize that, there are these food addictions and food allergies which are connected, and wheat is one of the commonest foods that people get both allergic and addicted to as a food. And what was probably the most prominent plant source of LSD is ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye and wheat and was probably cultivated in ancient Greece deliberately. The ergot was as the vision-inducing beverage that was the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries. If Wasson and Hoffman and Schultes are correct in their theory about this, and there have been newspaper reports from England of pharmacologists and doctors claiming that people who buy wheat or rye that may be contaminated with ergot may actually be ingesting active doses of LSD-type compounds. So right here in the central supportive grain of the Western civilization, you have a psychoactive vision-inducing plant built in, the knowledge of which disappeared for 2,000 years. And is now in process of being rediscovered. And what that really means for us gives much thought.
In hypothesizing about the early dawn of consciousness of mankind, if it were assisted by visionary plants, would this have made a genetic change in the DNA strand rather than just an experience for that hominoid or whoever it was that was enlightened? Could it have made a mutation, and then this consciousness was then passed on to their offspring?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and where we don't have all the information. But what it looks like happened was there were arboreal canopy living primates in Africa, in a tropical forest similar to the Amazon in extent. And over a long period of time, 100,000 years or so, drying set in, and grasslands emerged, and the forest retreated, and these primates who already had binocular vision and an advanced grasping hand and a social form of existence with group signaling, were forced down onto the veldt. And there, in a much more restricted environment in terms of numbers of species of plants, they abandoned their previous vegetarian, fruitarian habits and became omnivores, began testing all the food sources in the environment. Co-evolving in this grassland situation were herds of ungulate animals, bison and zebra and this kind of thing. In the manure of these animals was psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Well, you see, the psychedelic, to be the trigger for the emergence of human consciousness, it must be African, It must require no preparation. It must stand out from its environment, and it must confer an adaptive advantage. Now, it seems to me the only plant or organism which fulfills all these points is the mushroom. What the mushrooms do in low doses is confer slightly increased visual acuity. Well, you only have to have taken evolution 1A to know that if you have two populations and one of them has something in their food that increases visual acuity, and these are pack-hunting animals, that the ones with this vision-enhancing compound in their diet will have a more successful reproductive strategy than the competitors, and it will dominate. Well, at a slightly higher dose, psilocybin, like all CNS stimulators, can be interpreted as an aphrodisiac. In other words, prolonged erection, prolonged interest in sex, so forth and so on. At a slightly higher level, it flowers out into a visionary experience. So it's like a stair-step process where the deeper the organism imbibes this one item in the food chain, the more payback there seems to be. First better hunting, then better sex, then great ideas. Who could turn it down? And I've talked, like, when Rian Eisler and I appeared here, Rian is by no stretch of the imagination a psychedelico. I mean, she's a very straight and very wise lady, but not a stoner. But she said, you're right. There is something going on having to do with pastoralism, having to do with this point in time where the previous pack-hunting primates, instead of killing their prey, began to pen them and began to relate to them, to addict to them, is what it was. And I was saying to someone earlier today, here's a test of how conscious of the real world you are. What is the weirdest thing about a cow? And my victim said, the eyes. And I said, no, the weirdest thing about a cow is its tits. Obviously. I mean, have you ever seen tits like that anywhere else? These tits are made to fit a human hand. It's obvious. And so this is an example of very old coevolution, co-adaptation. The human being, the cow, and then less immediately obvious, but nevertheless powerfully present, is the mushroom. Joan referred to this morning. You see, I think what happened is women outsmarted themselves. The men were off silently hunting and practicing being quiet as they stalked their prey. The women were creating language in order to describe the taxonomy of these various food plants, of which they probably could distinguish 400 or 500 plants, seasons, soil conditions, variants, unusual conditions of all sorts, which parts of the plant were edible, which were poisonous, so forth and so on. And as always happens when you succeed in an enterprise where you seek control, you inevitably simplify. So the women became so conversant with the power of plants that they realized they need no longer gather them. They could grow them. And then they realized they wouldn't, of course, grow all the plants they knew about. They would only grow those plants that grew easily, produced large fruit, and had a big payback. And suddenly, the women undercut their own power base, and it became possible to silently practice very dulling agriculture. And the gods then became not the gods of the orgy and the hunt and the wild plants, but the gods became corn gods and wheat gods And it became important to be able to get up early in the morning and walk off to your field and weed, and less important to be able to ecstatically prophesy and have visions. Well, that's just one scenario, but it's worth talking about, I think, because how we image our emergence out of animal organization is going to color very deeply how we image our transition into a transcendental realm. That's why I talk about what I call the archaic revival rather than the new age. All this talk about shamanism is a reaching back 15, 25,000 years to those models to steady us. We should go out the way we came in, which means as a partnership society, as a psychedelic society, as a tribal society. And so by thinking about the origins, we actually gain an intimation of the future. Yes?
The persecution of witches is what's going on anyway. For those very things you're just describing for women.
Oh yeah, I mean, it is all of a piece. The suppression of women, it's a complicated thing. I mean, it has to do with solar calendars, which gained prominence with the invention of agriculture. See, I think the invention of agriculture was where it began to go wrong. Well, some people say it was the domestication of the horse or cities or this and that, but people idealize the Neolithic and think that this was fine. But I think already in place were notions of hanging on to the land, of storing wealth, of cooperating, coerced cooperation in the production of food, a simplified vocabulary about nature. All of these things were put in place by the Neolithic. But, you know, Arthur Young, some of you may know his theories, he has this idea that every state of freedom is accomplished by a descent into a state of bondage. It's so that, for instance, molecular chemistry is the product of the molecular bond. If you have chemical systems with so much energy that there can be no molecular bonding, then all you have is atomic chemistry. You have not the possibility of organic chemistry. So the coming and going of the male ego, the coming and going of the repression of women and the feminine seems to be related to how much exposure there is to these wild plant states. Because that, you see, women come up against it because they bury the dead, they birth the living, they know that all is not as it appears to be. They are informed of the fact that culture is a charade. But men believe all this stuff.
Well, at least those women that were able to, like the witches, were the women who, and a few men who stayed, who had the wisdom, the wisdom to stay in touch with the lore, the herbal lore, the plant lore. So they acted as midwives. They helped women have abortions when they wanted to get rid of their children. They acted as midwives. They did healing when the doctors at the time didn't have the knowledge to do so. So the Inquisition was kind of the result of an unholy marriage between the power trips of the medical profession against natural healers, which still exists, and the power trip of the church against the animistic religion. It's that because the church put its whole weight against this thing of the scapegoating process of using women as the scapegoats for everything that was corrupt within the church itself. It was because women were sinful and they sold themselves in league to the devil. And so from the church's point of view, they didn't really care about the plant lore. It's very interesting that a lot of plant lore really went defunct with the elimination and the execution of the witches, because there was nobody there who was at all interested in preserving it. In fact, the witchcraft trials give clear indication that when the women tried to say, well, when they were asked, well, why did you go and fly off and do this thing that was been reported to you? Or why did you fall down on the ground and you were lifeless for 3 days? And they said, well, it was because we took this little herb. And the inquisitor said, no, it's because you took the devil. And there's one poignant story actually recorded where the Swiss word for the German word for herb is Kraut, and the Swiss version of it is Krütli. So these Swiss witches that were being prosecuted, and the inquisitors said, well, who is your God? What makes you have these visions and these journeys? And they would keep saying Krütli. And so the inquisitors wrote in their books, they call their God Krütli. They call the devil, whom they have intercourse with, Krütli, because he's the one that takes them off on these journeys. So as a result, the knowledge got lost. So the lore, the herbal lore of the Middle Ages that the witches preserved was completely lost. I mean, the Inquisition took place between the 14th to 18th century. So that's comparatively recently. And the scapegoating mechanism, incidentally, there, also at play, which is very important, is the same exact mechanism that surfaces later than in the 20th century with the genocide. In that case, it's the Jews who, a particular race, was singled out as being the scapegoat. And in the earlier Inquisition, which has exactly the same pattern of the patriarchal power structure imposing this, picked the women as being the scapegoat at the time. Hopefully, one of the things that has to happen is that we can go beyond the need for scapegoating and take responsibility for our own growth and learning.
Embedded in all the monotheistic texts are the mention of women as creatures, so she has to be controlled.
Right. And Francis Bacon, who initiated the experimental method in science, talked about nature actually having to be violated. We have to force her secrets from her by force, by violence. It's sort of rapacious and
used the metaphor of the
language.
torture.
The torture. We have to torture nature to get out of here her secrets. Whereas true science, there is a true science. Much of what we call science is not true. There are a few individual scientists who are true scientists. They are like alchemists, they are lovers of nature. Like Albert Hoffman is a lover of nature. And he who loves nature and approaches nature with love and loving understanding is given nature's secret as a gift, as a grace, as a gift, which is why he was given it.
Yeah. A question on types of hallucinogens. You mentioned with psilocybin that was good for sex. And mescaline. Right.
That's also good for sex.
They're all good for sex.
I've seen the Yankees dance, and they take mostly peyote, which has mescaline in it, which is near methamphetamine. What about scopolamine? What does that do to you? And what about DMT? What does that emphasize in the journey?
Well, it's good that these questions are asked. The real source of information is largely folkloric in our own culture because, of course, we live in a society where research is not allowed. So it's all underground and clandestine. But you ask about scopolamine. Scopolamine is, along with L-hyl-cyamine and other things, the active ingredient in Jimson weed, which because of Carlos Castaneda and the practices of brujeria in Mexico is well known as a psychoactive plant. It certainly is psychoactive, whether it is psychedelic or not.
Maybe more like madness?
It's a kind of delirious frenzy. You go between delirium and frenzy, and you have a great deal of trouble remembering. It's what's called state-bounded. If you try to from my own point of view, if I were to try to describe the ideal shamanic plant, what it would do, it would not interfere with the short-term and long-term memory. It would clear your system very quickly, and it would be highly visionary. I am, I guess, just the kind of personality that values vision. So I really think it's weird when people say they took drug X and it was wonderful. And you say, well, did you hallucinate? And they say, well, no. well, then what was so wonderful about it? I mean, there must have been something, a feeling. But for me, what is fascinating is just the indole hallucinogens, this very small family, which includes psilocybin, LSD, ibogaine, harmaline and harmine, the beta-carbolines. Did I say DMT? Yeah, and that's it. Not even mescaline, which marks me as a kind of Calvinist in some people's books.
I always wonder why the Yankees could dance so long, and it's really amazing.
It's because it's an amphetamine, but these indole hallucinogens, what we're trying to get out here is we're trying to appear to be sane and rational people, so we don't seize you by the lapels and shake you. But what we're trying to get out here is that these things contain something that our art, our history, our literature, our religion did not prepare us for. And it appears to be an alien god, an unknown dimension, the edge of our ideological world in some way. Big excitement, not prolonged erection or enhanced memory or ability to rave all night or ability to recall instances of molestation in your childhood which may or may not have even occurred. But something else, something really transcendental, completely astonishing, and that as a rationalist, I think we have no right to expect that it exists. Most people don't know that it exists. People go from birth to the grave and never have the faintest inkling that there are these things in the environment which can just turn them upside down, set elves crawling through your drawers and jumping out of... I mean, really, reality just comes apart. If you've never had that experience, be assured that you could. A lot of people live their lives in the faith that there is no Santa Claus. Well, I've got news for you.
One thing I might add about scopolamine is it's scopolamine and atropine and hyoscine, which are derived from these nightshades, Solanaceae nightshades, were important psychoactives in the witches, which is the European medieval shamanic tradition, and they seem to produce a kind of the visionary, but different than the psilocybin or indole tryptamine kinds of visions, accompanied by a kind of like a twilight sleep, what brain researchers refer to as a theta state, just before sleep, where you get these kind of images, that you get a sequence of images like dreamlike, and then you kind of fade out. You go into sleep, which is why, and then you may wake up again and have a few more images, and your body feels very heavy and kind of asleep, and yet you're having these visions. It's interesting that, so there's that sense of confusion. You're not quite sure, did you see this? Did you dream it? What was it? That kind of thing. And because it's, it's a detachment from the body, scopolamine was quite commonly used in childbirth. Generations of women gave birth to children while in this kind of delirial twilight sleep state.
It was also used by the SS as a truth serum because they thought they could extract information. Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can we talk about ibogaine?
Oh, here, this guy.
In a recent article, the same magazine that Ralph mentioned, Terence, your mushroom article, Ralph Metzner wrote an article along with another person whose name I don't recall, on MDMA. And my sense was that you, Ralph, pretty much extolled the virtues of MDMA for experiences in the generic kind that we're discussing here today. Terence, you give criteria when you talk about what you think are useful criteria for substance selection in terms of what you think would be helpful for people that are interested in choosing or knowing the plants or knowing the substances that they're be interested in for consciousness expansion or etc. I just wonder if you both could comment on what you think about MDMA. It's had a lot of press. There seems to be certain camps that think it has a great virtue, and some people feel that it's just an excuse to take amphetamine.
The yuppies cocaine.
Do you want to go first?
Either way, you go first.
Oh no, you go
Give
first.
him the bad news. You give him the bad news, I'll give him the good news.
Well, it's a complicated question, and so I will give a complicated answer, which is the only answer that is true. First of all, it's a moving situation. Research is going on constantly. A couple of years ago, the question was, is MDMA good or bad? Now I think, although Ralph may disagree, the question has become, how bad is it? You have to talk, first of all, about the psychoactivity and then the physiological activity. The psychoactivity seems entirely salutary. People report tremendous breakthroughs in their personal growth. If it is, and as a drug of abuse, I don't think that's really a problem, although some people have proven that they can take a great deal of it. Where the pharmacology stands as of 10 days ago or so is it does destroy in the rat at fairly low exposures, in other words, only twice a human level exposure. It destroys certain microscopic structures on the dendrite of the nerve. Now, the problem is no one knows what these microscopic structures do, and there is no behavioral sequelae, great word, no behavioral sequelae that accompany the visible destruction of these structures. So there are three possibilities, or there are several possibilities. One is that whatever the structure on the dendrite is, it is not important past puberty. Think of it as a scaffold around a building, which once erected, the scaffold remains but is not performing any function. Therefore, this destruction that we see is not a problem. Or it may be that it's cumulative over the long period. What it basically does is it seems to show aging of brain structure very rapidly. At 120 days, again in the rat, there's no reversal of this. At 240 days, there's no reversal of this. So, but there is another drug, I think it's called fenfluridine, that is used to manage psychotics, and it also destroys in exactly the same way the very same structures. And it has been used with impunity in mental hospitals for 15 years. So what I say about MDMA is that a prudent course would be to wait and see. If it's really bad, they're going to find out. If it remains in this somewhat nebulous place, well, that means the people who think it's bad are actually losing ground. As a general rule, I never was very excited about MDMA because I'm just very suspicious of synthetics. And one of the things that is really terrible about the cultural climate that we're operating in was, here was MDMA, a drug with an apparent potential in psychotherapy that actually became popular in psychotherapy. And because there was no process for legalizing it, it was never tested at all. That's what the FDA gave us with Adam, was an utterly untested psychoactive drug because they refused to test it. So the fruits of ignorance are dendritic ablation in this case.
Well, because they refused to test it, because they couldn't persuade any drug companies to test it, because the drug companies couldn't market it, because the patent had already expired and it costs the drug company $5 million on the average to or more to take a drug through the human and clinical trials necessary before it can be approved and prescribed.
But don't you think in a civilized society, if they know people are taking this drug,
Right.
the government itself should pay for this
Yeah,
study?
and in some other countries that's exactly what happens. In England, for example, it may still happen that way. England may, in fact, still end up with a legal form of MDMA being possible because they run their sort of system a little differently than we do. I think the only thing I would add to what Terence has said, I mean, I basically share those views. I think that in a kind of a basic sense, if you're talking about the whole spectrum of psychedelic and psychoactive drugs, Adam is just not that interesting. It happens to be the most effective drug so far discovered for psychotherapy, for helping people sort out their emotional entanglements, emotional attachments, and balancing out the emotional nature. And that sometimes takes one session with MDMA, sometimes two, sometimes half a dozen in a therapeutic kind of context. And many therapists found that this was the case. And there's a book that we published called Through the Gateway of the Heart, which is available in the bookstore if you want to read a selection of accounts of experiences that people have had with it in a therapeutic context. And it's not visionary. Myself and somebody else simultaneously independently came up with the term empathogenic for it, generating a state of empathy. Simply seems to produce this kind of opening of the heart center from which then people can relate. They can look at their problems with empathy. They can look at other people, their relationships, and they can sort of just balance it out, clear it out. But apart from that, once people have done that, number one, people report that after having done that a few times, they can get to that same state of open-heartedness without it. And number two, that nothing much happens. There's very little content. Unless you have a problem to work on, there's really no reason, or somebody that you want to relate to and bond with and explore the relationship, there's really, what we should be doing is really the opposite of what we actually do. When we discover what we should be doing, it seems to me, is when we discover a synthetic drug that seems to have promise in treatment or whatever, psychically or physically, then we should try to look for the plant or animal analog for it, the natural product that we could then work with in that way. We do the opposite, of course. If we find a plant that's promising, we go in there, we extract whatever it is, then we synthesize that, and then we sell that back to the third world countries. And that often is then completely different, you know. Cocaine, synthetic cocaine, is a completely different story than coca leaf. Coca leaf chewing is a health-maintaining practice. Cocaine snorting is a death-dealing practice. The same difference between sugar cane, raw sugar cane or sugar beet is it's a nutritional food. Refined sugar is probably an addictive poison. So I see the MDMA has a potential, you know, in the use of therapy, and it's very effective that way. But for people that want to heighten creativity, explore visions, other states of consciousness, it's not that interesting. And finally, I would say that the search for the closest plant analog of MDMA has already been pursued by some people, and I think the closest that we've come to so far is low doses of peyote.
Mm-hmm.
Low dose peyote in extract form, tincture form, is an experience very similar to MDMA. The same kind of open-heartedness, the same kind of empathy, the same kind of energizing of attention, with certain advantages. And it does not seem to produce the kind of amphetamine drop afterwards that MDMA does, and it doesn't doesn't cut your appetite. In fact, it enhances your appetite and makes you eat. And there seems to be something that happens with proteins which then enhance and prolong the effect. So that's another reason why you get the drop in energy with the MDMA, is because you don't eat, and this doesn't have that disadvantage. So go with peyote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to ask you something about what's really going on, and everybody's a part of is, I've just been experiencing myself personally a synergy or an accelerating of some kind of I hate to call it a psychedelic movement, but in the past 3 months, the LA Weekly article comes out and I see Terence McKenna reopens the doors of perception. And then I hear on the radio 2 weeks later on KCRW, Mitchell Harding talked about the time he was doing acid, and every Friday there's like Sound 60 they're talking about doing acid, and I go, how come I haven't heard this for the past 5, 6, 7 years at all? If my ears been shut and I've just been oblivious, is it just because I'm starting to listen more? Or have you had a similar experience in the past few weeks, maybe past few months, a very fast growing interest by a lot of people, and I just am experiencing in Los Angeles, for this, when nobody talked about it. It seems like for 5 years, and suddenly I'm hearing all this input, and I'm fascinated, I'm turned on, I'm going, this is great, why did I think about this 6 months ago? Why is it happening just now? And it seems to be happening so fast and so strong. Is this true for you?
Well, I think there's some kind of critical mass. Something is going on. But, you know, some of us have been talking about psychedelics for nearly 10 years, and from the very beginning people said, you know, this must be it. This must be the second wave. I mean, people have been anticipating and announcing the second wave since 1980. Maybe it is. I don't know. I mean, right now, the most repressive drug measure imaginable is making its way through the United States Congress.
Yeah, this is a very minority position that you're looking at here.
When George
this is the Ojai Foundation.
When George Bush is elected, they're going to confront people with the choice of a drug-free society with a trashed Bill of Rights, or the present state of anarchy. They're very upset. These polls which show that, you know, the #1 issue is drugs. What a propaganda job you have to have done. I mean, there are people starving by the millions, thermonuclear weapons stacked like cordwood, people not saluting the flag, and they say the #1 issue is drugs. I mean,
well, they're doing the drugs themselves.
Well, I think that's it. That the drug issue, which when Ralph, God knows after the 60s, but in the second wave, when I started talking about it 10 years ago, we were just trying to get psychotherapists interested in looking at these things in therapy. And meanwhile, all this stuff is going on about crack and heroin and Noriega and this and that. So I think what it is that drugs are apparently on the historical agenda. We cannot exist half stoned and half down. We are involved in a process testing whether this nation or any nation can be... No, I'm kidding. The point is, though, you see, intelligence agencies have a huge addiction of their own, an addiction for untraceable money. And since World War II, they have, whenever they got tight for money, fallen back on their connections in the junk trade and the coke trade. And this was more or less overlooked because it allowed the creation of clandestine anti-communist armies in places like central Burma and South America and Iran. But now what's happened is that these international dope cartels have grown actually stronger than the governments that originally created them. So now there's a great deal of hand-wringing in the chancelleries and war planning rooms because the drug thing appears to have run amok. And I think that we're going to have to probably look at... I think the government's concern is they don't know where they'll get all this illicit money if they legalize drugs, but they seem to have set their own house on fire. They have a tendency to do this. I mean, I think of George Bush as a man who, when he sets his hair on fire, he puts it out with a hammer. And and the psychedelic issue is this tiny subset,
the little glitch,
never mentioned over in some corner, while they wrestle about who gets the money. That's the real drug issue from the point of view of government. Yeah, Joan.
Well, I think there's another factor here which was mentioned earlier, and that is with the increase of regulation of all aspects of our lives, so that there's a real decrease of freedom on all levels, that the impulse to actually create a context of liberation breaks out on many levels of society, not the least of which is a nostalgia for what broke open in the 60s.
I agree.
And not the least of which is the commercialization of shamanism.
Oh, yeah. People want authentic experience. People want some way of authenticating their lives. I mean, we're just sinking in an ocean of bullshit and propaganda led down the primrose path at the end of the 20th century, so narcotified and propagandized and sold out and undercut, and people want some way of breaking out of that.
And it's no mistake that it's happening on the eve of the presidential election either, where the shadow economy of the narcotizing drugs is in the background of this whole electoral process, and is actually the unexploded bomb in the campaign. But I mean, it's kind of...
That's right.
I mean, the drug in question is really up for grabs. It's not, by the way, I don't think it's not only cocaine and heroin, it's also alcohol. It's the whole range of anesthetic.
Well, if you want to talk about, a new way of talking about the drug problem would be, let's talk about drugs in terms of what they do. What do we want, and what do they do? So here you have a family of drugs, and the typical image of the addict. What is a drug addict? Well, it's a person who has an obsessive behavior pattern that is unexamined and that causes them to return again and again to the same source of stimulus or the same source of stimulus without ever cognizing the reason why. In other words, unexamined behavior is what is alarming about drug addiction, that people behave like they are obsessed. Well, on that scale, then the most powerful drug of the late 20th century is television and propaganda. And the way in which we consume propaganda is amazing. I mean, the most intelligent of us, the ones who hold ourselves most aloof, are probably junkies through and through when it comes to the media. And the media just makes you stupider and stupider and stupider. You become less able to formulate a creative response, less able to tell what is real and what is not, less able to empower yourself. And there's just more and more and more of it. The average American watches 6.5 hours of TV per day. Average. Imagine if a drug that you smoke or shoot or snort had been introduced into this country after World War II, and that now the average American was consuming 6.5 hours a day of this thing. I mean, you would have the fundamentalists foaming at the mouth. There would be riots in the street. It's that we define these things so oddly. We don't attempt to make sense. What I was trying to say this morning about the fact that we must change our minds. We must change our minds. Business as usual will lead to exacerbated conflict over resources and turf, and eventually thermonuclear catastrophe. If the evolution of consciousness is not the way to solve the world's problems, then I don't know what it is. Well, the psychedelics were originally described as consciousness-expanding drugs. That was the phenomenological description of what they were. We need to intervene in our own psyches. We cannot afford the luxury of an unconscious mind that can throw up a Hitler or a Khomeini. We cannot afford the unexamined obsessive behavior pattern that leads us into a conditioned response when somebody leans on our territory or insults our racial heritage or something like that. We have to realize that it is going to take creative intellectual engineering to steer us through the narrow valley of being. And it's always been that way. This is what shamanism is using plants to balance and control what is otherwise an extremely violence-prone, neurotic species. The price we pay when the symbiotic relationship to the rest of nature is interrupted, we lose our bearings. I'm not talking metaphorically. I don't mean about sniffing the air and making medicine wheels. I mean about putting the chemicals, the enzymes from the natural environment into your body that create the seamless web that unites us to the purpose of the planet. These psychedelic compounds are bearing information. They are pheromones from the body of Gaia that we, by imbibing, can then attune ourselves to the larger purposes of nature, so that we then can fit ourselves into the picture. We have a purpose. It is to care for the planet, to nurture it and lead it forward, much the way bees do, much the way termites do. But we are conscious creatures. Our caring, our honey making, our architectonic activities operate on a different epistemic mode because we have somehow one foot in a higher dimension. This is the mystery of ourselves.
Well, I just want to do the Sasha Shogun little number and just look at it, just because, I mean, this is a hell of a rave.
So do the number already.
It's real simple.
Mushrooms growing bullshit.
I mean, I get this, as I listen to you, I feel like the mushroom is out there, and it's kind of like an implant when you take it. And it actually shifts the context. Whereas I look at it in a certain way as not the end, but one of the means. And that it's not an implant, but it's actually a context actualizer, if you will. It actually opens, it's a biochemical key that opens a door to what's already there.
Oh yeah, it isn't an implant. It's that if you're not stoned, you're down. And to glorify that in this Calvinistic way that this society does is to say, only the depressed perceive correctly. Only the despairing truly understand. Only those who have given up hope have recognized the real situation. That's Western civilization's message to itself. And it's just ridiculous. No wonder people are down. Look at the history of Western Europe. All these gloomy male dominator types running around with sword and tongs to exterminate all unorthodoxy, to push the goddess religions to the frontier. Priestcraft, beastly little priests. It was Voltaire, I think, who said, mankind will know no peace until the last priest is strangled in the entrails of the last politician. And, if we're talking about shamanism, we're talking about the primary stratum of religious experience, which has been ripped off and sold down the river by every band of beastly little priesties that have ever come along. And they were the inventors of hierarchical orthodoxy. They are the ones who taught kings and popes their trade. And
but it's true that what they're against is the experience. They're not against. It's not the drug per se. That's also true for the psychoactive drug. Their importance is not the drug. It's not the plant even. It's the fact, it's the experience that they open up for you. That's the real significance. And that's the significant difference between psychedelic drugs and all other drugs. Cocaine, heroin, alcohol, barbiturates, amphetamines, all alter your consciousness. They don't teach you anything. The psychedelic plants are teaching intelligences with which we have the ability to enter into a relationship from which we can learn something about our role on this planet, on this earth, in the network, in the interconnected web of all life. So you can have the experience that people have had, that you can learn from a plant. from eating a plant what it means to be a human being. When you think about it, that's pretty peculiar.
Well, one teacher that I worked with called them actually teacher plants.
Yeah,
sure. Sexuality is a good intermediate example here, because orgasm is a buzz, and you don't have to wonder if they would have illegalized it if they could have. You know, it's what alarms them, and so they make you feel guilty about masturbation. God forbid that you should even have impure thoughts. They just, try to say, do not experience your body. Do not elevate your mind. Do not touch anything which empowers you, which authenticates you, which unifies you to yourself and other people. All that is bad. We will tell you where God is. We will answer all questions. So the drugs really, it's interesting. They are like an augmentation of felt experience, exactly like sexuality is. And I think it's sexuality that has kept us sane. If they could have repressed it, they would have. God knows they tried hard enough. Now that's been broken open. The clawed hand of the paternal male ego has been being slowly forced open for about 500 years. I mean, it's been a long march. These guys had it all sewed up around the year 1100 or something. And
3,000.
Well, it comes and goes.
Last week the Senate closed the hand a little.
How?
There's an anti-pornography bill that's just been passed by the Senate. It's on its way to the House.
Yes. Well, this is another way of
print, cable, television, etc.
And mysticism, mystical experience, even without drugs. Mystics have always been heretics. They've always been at odds. The church has always felt uncomfortable. I knew a man who was thrown out of his monastery for having mystical experience, nothing to do with drugs. He just kept having spontaneous mystical visions, and they said, "You don't belong here." What?
They were psychiatrically evaluated.
Yeah.
And off they went. Jackie, isn't that true? Yeah.
They told him, go out and have a family, get it out of your system.
The general social attitude toward madness, the fact that shamans, witch doctors, this is what they were called until 30 years ago when anthropology rescued the term shaman. There's great fear of getting off the track, of leaving the idols of the tribe behind. And yet the momentum of the idols of the tribe have pushed us to the point of global catastrophe. We must get off the track. The track leads right straight over the edge into an abyss.
Obliteration.
But the direction, don't you think we should be talking more to our leaders? I mean, they should be experiencing the same psychedelic things that we're experiencing.
Well, the question then becomes, who are our leaders?
Well, wait a minute. In fact, we know who our leaders are. They're the people in power.
Well, but there's different centers of power. For instance,
the people running things.
Different kinds of leadership, too.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, I agree. I think that the managerial temperament is the one who has to be reached. That the people who control world banking, world commerce, the direction of scientific research, and I think these people can be reached. I think that to a degree greater than we tend to realize, they are our peers. It's a matter simply, I think you can convince anybody of the rightness of this position. I mean, well, I think I could. I can't imagine how you could flatten me.
There is some interesting...
For that reason, I worry that making it a mass phenomenon now, in some ways, will antagonize them and make it more difficult.
Well, I don't think we're in any danger of making it a mass phenomenon. I mean, Tim Leary, in the great heyday of the 60s, talked to more people before lunch than I have talked to in my entire speaking career. I mean, he addressed crowds of 150,000 people. That's not the way to do it. I think Aldous Huxley had a much better notion, which is to reach the people who are themselves catalytically active in society. And to me that means the writers, producers, designers, choreographers, artists, teachers, politicians, but they have so much, they're so nervous. You know, they will be the last to join. But for instance, bankers, the people who own the world need to be convinced that their investment is threatened. That will sober them up. And I think they are. I think the greenhouse effect, once we get this summer into the bag and the world statistics are jotted up and we see how many billions of dollars the greenhouse effect cost people who own the cereal producing lands of the Western Hemisphere, they meet. They're concerned. I think the turn is on. You know, H.G. Wells said, history is a race between education and catastrophe. Well, it's neck and neck in the home stretch, but I don't think anybody should tear up their ticket and toss it in the air.
One interesting thing that's happening, too, is that people are now, this economist, Michael Phillips, for example, has made this interesting prediction that the 90s, see, there was an interesting parallel between the 1960s and the 1890s. They both were times of social revolution, new ideas. But those ideas didn't really get into legislation until the teen years, so which would be 30 years later, when the people that were the teenagers and early adults during that time of social upheaval become the majority in Congress. See, we had, in the 60s, we had, you know, the social and the sexual and the ecological revolution. We even had legislation like the EPA and so forth, but they all get watered down. And basically it comes back to making deals and business as usual. But by the 90s, he's predicting, again, we will have the 60s baby boom generation will be a majority in Congress, so that is a time when they think that there will be a legislation passed that will put teeth into a lot of these movements, including the environmental thing, which is, you know, forcing itself on everybody's attention anyway. So I think there are some helpful signs in that direction.
Nancy's halfway there with astrology. I mean, psychedelics.
Politics makes strange bedfellows.
Well, I need to say something about the high school. I take LSD and various psychedelics with a lot of high school children. And I've been scapegoated by the police in various communities as a threat of corrupting the morals of their children. And I have been in 2 torture chambers. One in Florida and one in Colorado for that. But what I wanted to say was that the law just put all drugs, including psychedelics, in a taboo thing. And a lot of the high school children, they're taking all kinds of drugs. And I've taken LSD that they have given me, and it's not real LSD, and it affects your nervous system, it makes you shake, it doesn't make you aware, it makes you dumb. And but they're buying LSD in high school anywhere from $2 to $8 a dose, and it's not real LSD. And I turned them on to real LSD, and they love it. And they play around with computers in class on real LSD that I've given them. And
well, you're a real menace to the youth.
But you're right.
They get great grades from real LSD. So what I'm saying is that somehow there has to be a real LSD distributed, real psychedelics distributed.
Well, what there has to be is an uncorruptible source of psychedelic experience.
Yes.
And, you know...
In a sanctuary environment also.
Well, in some way it has to be uncorruptible, and the best way that I've found is to urge people to grow mushrooms, because the mushroom itself then acts as the purity maintainer, the quality control. You can see what it is. When you have LSD in front of you, you have a little piece of paper or a little piece of gelatin. Who knows what this is, you know? And some way to extract the drugs from the market economy. This was what undid the 1960s. Some people got high on LSD, and other people realized you could make a fortune on it. And once that realization hit home, it was all she wrote. So there has to be, some way of taking the opportunity to create a huge financial empire out of it. And how this is done, I'm not sure, but the simplest solution, I think, is grow your own and depend on nature. Nature is a bountiful storehouse. This is where these things come from, and
grow or gather.
Grow or gather. Somebody over here. We haven't done much over here this late.
This question is for Terence. Can you speak a bit about your experience in some of the older societies you've lived in, and the relationship between visual artists, artisans, object makers, and shamanism?
Shall I repeat your question? The question was, could I speak about the relationship of artists to shamanism in some of the more, the pre-literate Amazon societies that I've been in? Well, I think, people have the notion about tribal people, that their life is very hard. In some environments and some situations it is, but people try everywhere to create leisure for themselves and to have an opportunity for aesthetic expression. In psychedelic societies, everything is art. I'm thinking particularly of, for instance, the Shipibo in their classic expression. The Shipibo are an Amazonian tribe. They cover every utilitarian object with design. Everything is an expression of the images of the internal world, and language and puns and this sort of thing become very important. Life, when you have nothing, life is easily transformed into art, because there's a howness about everything. How you make a fire, how you cast a pot, how you cook a monkey. Everything is a paradigmatic activity, meaning everything is traditional, everything has been done millions of times before in the way that your people do it. And so the individual is seen almost like just the cutting edge of the ancestral energy. And they even have the concept of what they call the way of the ancestors. And so you'll be doing something like sharpening a stick, and someone will come up to you and say, don't do it that way. We do it this way. This is the way of the ancestors. Then they show you how to do it, and sure enough, it is easier to do it that way, probably because this is the morphogenetic field of the howness. And I think Ralph mentioned this morning the confluence of yoga, alchemy, and shamanism in the Taoist tradition. And I think it's worth stressing that, because to my mind, Taoism is the most refined ideal of human existence. It is open-ended. It always yields to a good laugh. It's not dogmatic. It's rooted in nature. It sees the world as shells of energy that can be manipulated and cultivated. And I really see Taoism as something broader than the nature religion that arose in southern China pre-Confucius and so forth. I see it as the kind of natural way of being in the world that tribally alive societies settle into. And it's what we're trying to recreate. Appropriate activity. That alone would create a world-informing revolution. when I say that we must change our minds, the physical accompaniment to changing our minds is that we will begin to behave appropriately, bury our shit, manage our resources, lower our voices. It's simply awareness, and awareness of awareness. And this is what these societies have that we have lost. And I think it's because the male ego is a wart on human perfection. And everybody has one. It's not a put down of man. The male ego is a part of the repertoire of every human personality in the modern world. But it is unnecessary, divisive, and out of Tao. And this reconnection with the Tao, with the flow, with the invisible, the spirits, the energies of sky and water and earth, the psychedelics impel us into recognizing these things, but it's our own intent that can allow us to bring these things back into the world and apply them. So for me, that was the lesson of so-called primitive people. You want to talk about that?
Well, the only thing I would add to it would be that the male ego has come out of touch, but it can be reconnected. There's nothing inherent in that structure, that psychic structure or function in itself. The ego is simply that function that through which means of which we function in the world. What gets it into trouble is this thing of assuming that it knows the only reality, and it has claim to value over other. It's not a relatedness, it's a superior, separative, superior, dominating, controlling trip that it tries to run. But at the same time, the Taoists show to a way of functioning with decisiveness. Taoism is not a passive or inert or quietistic religion or practice at all. It's being able to act and to function with the flow, with the grain of nature, so that your actions are in harmony with nature and therefore by themselves successful. And Taoism has proven itself to be remarkably resilient. It's not by any means a religion of ancient China. It's a 5,000-year or longer tradition and teaching that is alive and well to this day in communist China and other parts of the world. And we also have to recognize that we're not going to be able to go back to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. We're never going to recreate great areas of wilderness we've lost. We're never going to be able to get away from city living. There is such a thing as urban shamanism, and it's one of our tasks to really invent that. That's something brand new. Aboriginal cultures do not have it. How do you live in a city environment in the late 20th century, while recognizing that in this city environment too, the other worlds, the worlds of spirits, of animals and plants, is right there in the streets of New York and under the concrete, in the sewers. Some of you may have seen this film, The Last Wave, which is about the Australian Aboriginal, the survival of an Australian Aboriginal culture under the streets of Sydney. It's a very interesting story. So this is where this is going to require all the resourcefulness that we can come up with. We have to study the past, take the valuable lessons that we've forgotten, bring them back into, put them together with the new information that we're getting, that science has presented us with, plus our knowledge of the limitations of the existing political structures, and go to work and use whatever you can. Spoiled.
How do we step aside from the information that, all of us here obviously must think about this, is information coming through the television or the great mediator. This fascism that's so subtle because it's so sub-embedded, because it's entirely a censorship of economy. So you experience it just a pragmatic reality. You don't experience it as what it is, controlling and telling us how we are to perceive reality. And, we had the 60s, we had an inkling of the shamanic or the experiential, then that was pushed aside. So I think it's a test case to watch with this election. I'm sorry that you said when Bush is elected. I'd like to think that's an if. But when you talked about that unexploded bomb, well, let's see how the forces of disinformation can repress that unexploded bomb and allow Bush to get reelected, or how to learn to continue to look between the lines and not. I was close to historical events, learn to look between the lines, and yet I ingest daily stuff that I don't question because it seems low on the order of priority whether I should look and see what is this really about. But we're given a 360 hologrammatic redefinition of our reality entirely through the media.
Manufactured
and lazily
consent.
we consent and co-create by ingesting it. So that's the thing, to sidestep that and look for the nature ally.
You have to look at it with the same attitude as you look at visions presented to you in a drug state or in a dream state, with that same impeccability, with that same discrimination. Keep testing, keep looking. Use what you know. Compare. Does this true for you? Is this what's really behind it? What's the hidden message? What's the hidden agenda?
And trust
The
your
stuff that's
instinct.
barraging us from television or from the media is it's a complete mix of truth with undescribable dosages of fantasy, hallucination, projection, disinformation, malevolent intrusions, and there's no shortcut. There's no way of sidestepping it. You can't sidestep it. You have to confront it, deal with it, look at it, know it.
But when you look at the cultural images that we've inherited, I think it's very easy to see that monotheism is a great deal of what lies at the root of our problem. Because, it was Jung who made the observation that as we picture our gods, so then do we model our psyches. That in fact our gods are models of our psyches. And monotheism, which is basically the idea that God is all-powerful, omnipresent, male, and not to be trifled with, if that's your model of the psyche, well then you're describing someone who's extremely pathological. I mean, that is a pathological model of the personality. And yet, how many generations of men have behaved as though they were Yahweh? And we buy into this unquestioningly.
The issue of
Yahweh is the only God, the only divinity, the only God in all of world mythology who never has sex with a female. Most other creation myths involve sexual or have consorts, the Indian god. Yahweh, who is the Christian and basically the Islamic god too, is the only one who never has contact with a female, either human or divine. Pretty interesting. That's our God.
I'm just going to say this thing about abortion. It's
back there.
The metaphor that you'd say that man's law would be stronger than the laws of nature that women experience stringently as the doors open and close of birth and death, and that man would impose himself on the doorway between nature through the woman's body to creation. That's the final metaphor.
Well, that's omnipotence.
Yes.
Omnipotence. We can interfere with anything. We can do anything.
Back there.
Back here somewhere.
I mean, much or not close to all of what you say is really pearls to my ears, and I feel there's a resonance, especially when people have waited to hear something described in a certain way. It's like coming home. There's a real fine edge that I feel in myself when we get to a place of an us and them really strong. And I noticed that when this man brought up the thing about the politicians, there was a certain uncomfortableness and a kind of laughter that very easily came forth. And I know that in my work with the nuclear waste issue, it's very easy to get in this almost victimized role. It's like someone else is doing it to us. And it seems to me, in part of almost strategizing together, if we really want this truth that you're, describing to really be present on this planet and in our midst, that there's one aspect of like we have work to do ourselves. That's to me the strongest thing that you said. If you can really embody it impeccably and continue to look at your own homework, that you don't have to so much worry about what's going on around you. But there's another place where it seems to me we do have to worry or be concerned or care for what's going on around us. And in being impeccable on that level, it seems to me that some of the mind change has to do with this shift of us, them, and seeing them as the enemy and us as the victim. And I know that in the nuclear work, one of the strongest things we did was to take
a group of people down to Westinghouse, down to where they're supposedly burying the waste in the ground, to see that the people that have taken on this job are actually, they really believe they're doing the right thing, and they really believe that they're doing it for us. And to almost, from that place of common ground, start trying to share this information. So I'm wondering in terms, I guess I just really felt personal need to comment about that in face of this us-them place that we can get into, and to see if you have any comments about our impeccability in terms of dealing with this situation correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't really think in terms of us and them. I really resist paranoia. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, or I don't believe that anybody is running the world. I think it has a life of its own. I think that I agree with you. The major task is the task of working on oneself, but not entirely to the exclusion of social responsibility. The major contribution most people can make in the theater of social responsibility is clarity of thought and intention. The general tone of the discussion arises out of the quality of the people participating in it. And you can reach most people if you will start with something that they're familiar with, and then try and lead them out of it. I mean, I'm amazed in all the years that I've been talking about the things that I talk about. I have never been heckled, ever. No one has ever stood up quaking with righteous wrath and quoted chapter and verse or denounced me. And it's because I will argue with anybody unto the 9th hour, if necessary. I really think that the best ideas will come to the fore, and that there are no evil people. There is no group that with behavior. I mean, who among us cannot think back on our own behavior to moments that hardly exemplify the Gaian ethic? So then how can we expect more or anything better than that from other people? The real task, I think, is one of linking together through communication, which people don't realize when they're not communicating. But what we're doing right now, this is a very unusual activity. Even the most intelligent of us go through our ordinary day basically with grunts and groans. That's how we signal to each other. But creating a shared mind space, a consensus of understanding, requires people talking to each other and clearly speaking from the heart about what they know and understand. Ralph introduced me to the notion of clairparlance. This is a psychic ability that we're trying to cultivate. Clairparlance is clear speech. You know, William Blake said the truth cannot be told so as to be understood without being believed. That's the greatest weapon the truth has. But if it is articulated and you hear it, you will serve it. And so will George Bush, and so will anybody else who hears it. The power of the truth is its immediate, limpid rightness. And so cognitive activity, and this really goes back to the theme of the weekend, which is shamanism. To my mind, what shamans really are people who indulge in cognitive activity. They communicate, they dance, they sing, they chant, they tell stories, they speak out, they orate, they pray, they communicate. And in so doing, they empower everyone around them to open their hearts and their minds.
Reagan was a shaman. There is a shaman.
Oh yes, it's stage magic. And there is this, and you can't understand why it works. And it does, and it is morally neutral. This is the other thing. I mean, Goebbels, you can forget Ronald Reagan. This is a piker and a buffoon. Joseph Goebbels was the man who understood the power of information and communication. And if he believed the best idea wins, then he can only shake his head at the fate that overtook his ideas. Because here was a millennial dream that 12 years after it was launched, people were living in basements on rats. So it's a matter of allowing the ideas to fully express themselves through us. We can only advance into the future at the rate at which we can transform our language. And we can only transform our language by working with it. This is why design and art and music and all of these things are so important. The artist, who appears to be the weakest among us, actually creates the context for everything to happen in. So that it's so bizarre to hear right-wing politicians, for instance, talk about terms like spin and hype. And, I mean, they use the language by grafting certain concepts onto the language. You make it impossible for people not to agree with you. You actually foreclose the option of disagreement. They know this, and we know this. So this is the theater where the battle goes back and forth, to say what the world is in such a way that you convince everyone, and then we can get down to the business of living in that world. And history really is this process of trying to generate a guiding image that serves. And so someone, Christ, Mohammed, Buddha, will project the guiding image, and it gels in the unconscious and becomes a creode, and a vast set of historical forces follow it the way water follows a dry arroyo. But then the way is lost. It's not clear which direction the flow should go. Then there must be a new guiding image. And I think that the guiding image that we have been operating under, which is the property-owning male citizen, is giving way to a new guiding image, which is the planetary steward androgyne shaman. And this image reconnects us to nature, reconnects us to the lost part of ourselves, and will serve then until circumstances change, and then it too will have to yield to some new definition, because we are ultimately malleable. We are like water. We take upon ourselves the shape of the container into which we are poured. And this is what history is the flowing from one container to another.
I think that I wanted to just connect.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you to comment on a remark you made this morning about anticipating the future and how information drifts back through time. Could you say more about that?
I thought you would never ask.
Could you repeat the question?
What it refers to my comment this morning that a portion of shamanism is the anticipation of the future by accessing information which drifts backward through time. Well, I think my interpretation of what religion is, other than the scheming of eunuchs, is there is something there. There is something there transcendent and compelling. And what it is I think, an anticipation of a future event, an anticipation of a future state of human completedness, that actually ahead of us in time, our destiny, whatever it is is casting an enormous shadow backward into what we call history. And that in fact one way of thinking about history is as the shock wave which precedes an eschatological event. 100,000 years ago, there was no intimation of an eschatological event. There were simply hunters and tribalism and animal existence embedded in the life of the planet. Then slowly there has grown, like an ever-increasing downward rolling boulder, a momentum of intuition that there is something, a great change is in store for us, that we are all going to become enlightened, or that the Messiah is going to come, or that the extraterrestrials are going to rescue us from ourselves. The intimation of a sudden shift of epoch and an ingression into ordinary history of the transcendental. Now, some psychologists might say this is nothing more than the culture's reaction to the inevitable fact of death, that every one of us will recapitulate this process, that death itself is like an enormous shadow at the end of life, sending a flickering signal back through our existence. And when you're young, death seems far away and has no power. But as you live your life, you suddenly realize that the walls are growing steeper, the water is moving swifter, there is a kind of inevitability, and that you don't want to stare this inevitability in the face. Well, I think the historical process is like that, and that we are in the grip of what I call a singularity, that it is cultural, that the evolution of techne to become an ever more limpid mirror of the self is turning into a kind of process where we are becoming the objects of our imagination. We are, through cultural evolution, actually creating our own eschatology. You know, Plato said if God didn't exist, man would invent him. Well, there are many different kinds of gods for humanity to invent. And one of the most satisfying, I think, is this eschatological hypostatization that lies outside of history and informs it. This is what the seers are reacting to. This is what inspires the careers of the prophets, and it is, I maintain, what shamanism is about. We've offered many definitions of shamanism here. Here is another one. A shaman is someone who has seen the end. That's all. Once you've seen the end, it's like going with a friend to a movie that you've seen and they haven't. You have a completely different relationship to it. You are anticipating their enjoyment of it, their moments of fear, anticipation, and pleasure, but you are above them looking down. You have already seen the end. You know the punchline. And every shaman in every culture gains his or her humor, balance, healing ability, wisdom, if you will, by having participated in the transhistorical eschatological object. And modernity just denies this. The theory of history taught in the universities is what's called the trendlessly fluctuating theory. That just means war, revolution, reform, revolution, war, reform, revolution. It's like a random walk across the landscape with a steady increase of techne, rising Malthusian pressures, but that's all. It's because there is no place for the transcendent in the scheme of rationalism as we inherit it from the late, from the Enlightenment. But in fact, if what the psychedelic experience argues, what our dreams argue, what our good sense argues, is that it is not business as usual on this planet. And history is not a random walk that has tens of millennia yet to run ahead of it. That actually we have set off processes that finalize our time upon the earth. finalize the duration of our present cultural mode, we are going to have to fish or cut bait. We have built this into our myths about our world, that it has an ending, and so it shall. And I think shamanism anticipates this superhuman condition out of which we arose in ilio tempore, before history, and into which we shall be subsumed at the end of the historical peregrination. The myth of our culture is the myth of the prodigal son. We made the descent into physis, into the world of matter, into the well of the world, if you wish. Our job to recover a piece of lost information about the nature of the soul, and then return to the tribal family, to the shamanic, prehistoric and post-historic mode, where then the fruits of history will be not thanatoptic in their consequences, but transformative. Anticipation of the future.
I'll follow on that. I'm thinking of the second book of the I Ching and asking that question about the reversibility of time, going both ways. And also, in that second book, there's an interesting comment on the actually the contrast or complementarity of creativity and transformation. Was to suggest that they're processes that flow counter to one another. Could you?
Well, I think the I Ching is a special obsessive interest of mine, specifically the kinds of things you're talking about. There is this body of commentary that is pre-Confucian, late Zhou, early Han, that is puzzling in the present context of the I Ching. And I think this is what you're referring to. And there's a place where it says, the backward running numbers refer to the future. The forward running numbers refer to the past. And you say, well, what does this mean? There are no backward running or forward running numbers. There are just 64. No, it's because the I Ching as we possess it today is a piece of broken machinery. It is actually an extremely sophisticated understanding of time, couched in an intellectual and epistemic domain that we can barely cognize because it arises out of a different kind of language stratum. But really, I think being is a kind of interference pattern where the forward-flowing casuistry of what are called prepotent situations, like the rolling downhill of a ball bearing, the momentum of happenstance, where the momentum of happenstance meets this more mysterious carrier wave from the future, and together they form an interference pattern. I remember I was very impressed where the Amazon River flows into the Rio Negro. These are both huge rivers. They're each about 12 miles across where they meet each other. And so consequently, they are like two waves coming together. And where they meet, they form a standing wave. And you can actually sail up to this bump in the river. And it's quite large. I mean, it's 5 or 6 feet high, and you can sail along it. It's like a ridge in the middle of the river, and you can see that all the material is in motion, but the wave itself is stable. It is what is called a standing wave. And I think that this is what being is. Science has attempted to give a very full account of the forward-moving momentum of happenstance. But we deny that there is appetition for the future, or that the future is somehow shaping events. And in our denial, we are then left with a blind spot in our account of reality. I'm going to teach a 5-day workshop at Esalen the week after Thanksgiving in which psychedelics will barely be mentioned. And the I Ching and its mathematical dynamics will be the entire focus of this, because I take this notion very seriously and have worked it out in excruciating detail, because I think that the wave form of the Tao can be known and was known, and that there are technologies of interior observation, which is what yoga is, but Taoism in its early and incipient phase was a similar kind of technology that allow real insight into the future. The future is not determined. If it were, thought would be meaningless. But it has, it's like water flowing over a dry arroyo. The water takes the shape of its container, and the water of historical happenstance flows into the vessel of the future, which already exists, and takes its shape.
Comment on the opposition of creativity and transformation in that same chapter?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about you see those as opposed?
I thought that one led to the other, but in reading that, it seems that there's some question, and I'm puzzled by it.
Well, I think you have to read the I Ching with a grain of salt. I mean, why does before completion come after completion? There are a number of puns. I mean, it can be read as very deep, but not without humor, I think. And it is, Taoistic thinking is inherently contradictory. The coincidentia oppositorum used to create cognitive dissonance. So you never have the satisfaction of logical closure that you get in Hegel or somebody like that. You're always left not sure, not knowing. Ralph, do you want to sum this up? I got carried away here. I thought my watch said 4:30 and it said 5 o'clock.
Well, we said we were going to stop at 5, so I don't think there's any way to try to sum it up.
Well, you could just add.
Well, one thing I just thought we have had some thoughts about tomorrow, and also maybe some of you have some particular wishes or that you'd like to express about that. And but the one thought we did have about we might do tomorrow is tell stories rather than present ideas or information. To tell stories, and Terence has some stories, I have some stories, and many of you will have some stories, and that are related to your theme. And stories, I mean, one way of looking at our lives is that we're creating and living out each story, and we're trying to make it stories that are interesting and productive and life-sustaining, life-enhancing. What are stories that have your own personal stories that happened to you, or fairy tales, myths, or ones that that you're working with in your process that you might want to share? So, and we might want to use a staff for that, a talking staff, so that the storyteller has the staff and pay a little attention to the flow. So you might dream about that. You might have some dreams, and that's what we have in mind about tomorrow. I did want to mention one little thing that may be happening around here, and I want to mention it in the sense of sharing an observation in the spirit of perhaps some of you are also picking it up. I had a dream last night, and I've since talked to 2 other people who had similar dreams last night here, in which there was some kind of attack by not so friendly spirits. In my case, they were just indistinct humanoid, could have been aliens, could have been humans. I had no way of knowing. I didn't know anything except their intent. They caused me actually to scream in my dream. And somebody else experienced a gang of street punk gangsters, kind of challenging, invading, intruding. So there may be something happening during this era. Paranoia on anybody, but just to tune in, and perhaps some of you will have something to report tomorrow, or perhaps some of you know about it already. If you do, I'd appreciate knowing about it, and there might be some opportunities to discuss it.
Pay attention, you could be the next Whitley Strieber.
Yes, abductee. So maybe we should end with some a few minutes of drumming. And then, when is dinner? 3 other main kind of paths or types that are known, ways of knowledge within the kind of shamanic context that some of you may relate to. Probably the most common one, actually, the one that most people relate to, is the shaman as healer. And this is the one that where the shaman functions as the physical and spiritual healer of his family, his or her family, and immediate village or tribe, and does shamanic work for the purposes of healing. Part of that includes an aspect of the warrior. The warrior is a necessary part of the healer function, because in the process of health maintenance, the warrior function is the function that defends your body against infections and toxins. The immune system is the warrior function of the body, of our system, seen as an aspect of healing, maintaining the integrity of the system. And then another very prominent path is the one that Terence referred to a great deal yesterday, was the path of the artist or the maker. The artist, the maker of tools, the craftsman, which would include scientific inventors and people that build tools and perceptual instruments, for example, that facilitate our perceptual and cognitive understanding of the world, communicate our vision. And then another path is the path of the seer, or prophet, or visionary. In some cultures, such as the ancient Paleolithic Basque culture of Europe, the sole surviving pre-Indo-European culture in Europe, they have a class of people called vision makers, who are the ones that you go to if you have a problem, or you need to get you want to get an insight into your life path, your life destiny, a professional oracle, as it were. So I wanted to share that with you because it might trigger off some thoughts about, I see different people who are engaged in shamanic work having different combinations of those different qualities. Terence is obviously very strong on the explorer, adventurer, and the artist, communicator. I have some of the healer, also the adventurer, explorer is my main one, with some of the healer and some of the artist, communicator also. Some of the warrior, but not as much as several of my friends that I know. One interesting additional difference between the path of the warrior and the path of the explorer that I also learned recently is that the adventurer, the warrior, in terms of to seek a vision, is more likely to go for an ordeal, where pain and stress is used as a way of expanding your perception, pushing your boundaries. And so the kind of thing that Wallace Black Elk is wont to do, of inserting himself into a hole in the ground, suspended from hooks in the chest, 2 days and 2 nights without food or water in total darkness. That's an ordeal. See, it's not natural. I mean, you're going out of your way. Nature isn't doing that to you. You're going out of your way to create a stressful, limiting situation in order to be able to transcend or push that limit further. The adventurer explorer tends to, again, because the attitude isn't quite as, it's not quite as hard as that of the warrior, to go to nature herself, the wilderness, pure wilderness. Now, wilderness may be an ordeal, But it may not be. It may be a sheer ecstasy. And it's in the wilderness with its shifting, mysterious patterns that you have to be alert. You can't just indulge and say, well, Mother will take care of me, because Mother Nature will not take care of you. Mother Nature doesn't give a shit about you as an individual. Basically, you know that, and that's a very important realization. If you think Mother Nature is going to take care of you like your mother did, I mean, you can be dead in 2 seconds flat out in the wilderness. If you attend, though, and pay attention, then you can survive, and not only survive in the wilderness, you can learn a great deal from it. You can enter into a communication relationship. So, wilderness is the preferred mode of vision path, I think, for the adventurer, explorer. And that could be the wilderness internal as well as external.
Can we cheer occasionally when you...
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so having said that, I want to read you a brief passage from Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which he summarizes basically what both Terence and I said yesterday in a few memorable lines. The ancient...
know who's on top in terms of literature.
well, he was one of our great visionaries. He saw it at an early age. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. Oh! And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country. You know, they had this concept of the genius loci, spirit of the place, placing it under its mental deity, until a system was formed which some took advantage of to enslave the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood. Very important sentence. Till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood. No way, Jose. Choosing forms of worship from poetic tales, and at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus, men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. Oh. One last passage from this same Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Fantastic text. The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard from hell. There's your apocalyptic vision right there. For the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life. See, the cherub is standing guard at the tree of life to prevent humanity from attaining immortality. That's what Jehovah said. You know, you've got to go, because otherwise you might eat from the tree of life and you become immortal like us. Exclusionary system. So, the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life, and when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas now it appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. For aphrodisiacs and hallucinogenics. Yes, and each other. But first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives. You know, it was Blake's doing engravings in copper and etching the stuff, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern.
So I'd like to tell you a story, part of a story, part of an ancient story, an ancient myth, actually the oldest written myth of Western culture. Story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and the goddess Ishtar. It might also be called the story of the hero, the wild man, and the goddess. Or better, the goddess, the wild man, and the hero, just for the sake of balance. And in this oldest myth of Western civilization, I think more basic to the Western psyche than the Greek or the Egyptian myths, we find already all the themes in a prophetic way that we deal with now. The overbearing, male, patriarchal, heroic warrior ego trip, the distrust of the goddess, and the projection upon the goddess of qualities of human deceitfulness and treachery, the regret of what was lost in giving up the old goddess cultures and going to a male-dominated culture, and what was lost by leaving the wilderness and going into cities. And the price that was paid for that, the price that was paid for hubris, and the price that was paid for separation from our instinctual nature. And Gilgamesh was king of Uruk. Uruk was the city from which Abraham went out. Abraham was a pastoralist, a herder, a wandering nomadic herder. He took his herds of sheep and his tribe of people and founded another religion. Uruk was a city of farmers. Gilgamesh was a mighty king, a great warrior. He had built the city of Uruk with massive walls of stone. He had slain many enemies. He was said to be 2/3 God and 1/3 man. He was a mighty and powerful man and king. And he became overbearing and arrogant in his behavior towards his own people. He lorded it over the people. He bullied the young men, and he demanded that the young brides were given to him for the first night of their marriage. And he oppressed the people to the point where the people went and complained to the high gods and said, "You have to do something about this Gilgamesh king of ours. He lords it over us, he oppresses us, and he pushes it around till our lives are miserable. He is a tyrant." And the gods sitting in council agreed that something had to be done, that a counterpart player had to be created. So they went to the old ancient goddess Aruru, the creator goddess, who created both them and men, and said to her, please create somebody to balance out this raving Gilgamesh tyrant. Somebody who will be his equal in strength and courage, who will be like him, like his very self, like a second self, it says. Thereby pointing, this is an aside, to the fact that right here in this earliest story, we're dealing with a coded story that talks about the internal psyche. This second self is the second self within every one of us. Gilgamesh is the human self who becomes arrogant through power. Gilgamesh had a dream in which he saw a star fall from heaven. And the people came to pick up the star. And it was heavy, and Gilgamesh tried to pick it up, and it was so heavy he could not lift it. And he went to his mother Ninsun, who was herself a seeress, semi-divine seeress, priestess, who said, this dream symbolizes the one who is going to be born, who will be your counterpart, your brother, your equal, like unto you, like your very self. Gilgamesh had said in the dream, he bent down to pick up the star and he felt attracted to it like to a woman. And he had another dream in which a sword of unusual design was found in the town square. And nobody could figure out what it meant, and Gilgamesh picked it up and put it on his belt. And he went to his mother and asked her, what does this mean? And she said, this too is the one who is going to be born, who is like yourself, your counterpart. And he will be like your right arm. He will help you fight your battles and be your equal, strong like you. In the woods, a hunter saw a creature, a man, with the animals, running with the animals, drinking at the stream with the animals. This man was covered with hair all over his body and had long hair like a woman. And he ran with the animals and he drank waiting for. And Gilgamesh went to the priestesses of the temple of Ishtar and asked the priestesses of the temple of Ishtar to send one of their women priestesses, later on falsely called sacred prostitutes. They were not prostitutes. They did not sell sex for money. They offered love as an act of devotion to the goddess. Gilgamesh sent the priestess with the hunter and another companion out into the wilderness to search for this man called Enkidu. Enkidu. And they came to the place after 3 days walking and sat down and waited for 5 days. And finally Enkidu appeared with the animals to drink water at the stream. The woman from the temple of Ishtar went towards Enkidu and exposed her nakedness to him and took his hand to touch her breast, whereupon Enkidu was suffused with feelings and sensations he had never felt before at this hairless being who spoke and made sounds from her throat that he had never heard before. And they made love for 9 days and 9 nights. It is said.
Don't stop.
After 9 days and 9 nights, the woman said to Gilgamesh, we must bathe you. We must give you a haircut. They gave him a haircut. They bathed him. They anointed him in fragrant oils. They gave him human food to eat, sweet meats, grain, breads, fruit, cooked flesh. And when Enkidu attempted to connect with his erstwhile animal friends, he found he could no longer do so. They shunned him because he smelled differently, and he could not keep up with them when they ran. His legs were as weakened. He could not run as fast as he could before. They escaped. He no longer had any contact with them. He was saddened by this. But the people and the woman encouraged him and took him with them to the city and told him about King Gilgamesh and his arrogant, tyrannical ways. And Enkidu said, I will fight this man. I will right this wrong. And Enkidu came to the city where Gilgamesh was strutting down the main street. And they met in the main street, and they fought and wrestled for 2 days and 2 nights. And neither one could throw the other. And after many hours of battling and fighting, they stopped their fighting and embraced one another as brothers and friends, and henceforth were inseparable companions. And Enkidu came to live in the city and had a house and much wealth and a wife. And he and Gilgamesh went out and did many heroic deeds together. And this is the first part of the story, which is the story of humanity's transition from the wild state to the city-dwelling, cultured, Neolithic farming state, from the existence as wild, nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in the fields in a wild state, in the wilderness. We were all wild men. Not only do we have a wild man, wild woman within us, those are our ancestors. We were that for hundreds of thousands of years, much, much longer, 10 times as long as we were city-dwelling, farming, pastoralists, technological, literate people. So, and this story tells about the price that is paid for this separation from nature, for the separation from our own wild nature, our own instinctual nature, the loss of the communication and the communion that we had with the animals, and the knowledge of the land and the plants and the forests. For the advantage of city dwelling, of language, of sexuality. And it's the role of the woman. And it's very instructive to compare this story of the transition from wildness to culture, from nature to culture, from wildness to civilization, with the story in the book of Genesis, which was the story of the Abrahamic pastoralists that went out of Uruk to the land of Palestine. And the role of the woman in that story, where the woman is blamed for the decline from an Edenic state, with really no advantage to the state that they then went into. The state outside of the Garden of Eden is a pure fall, a pure disaster. In the Gilgamesh story, which is older, Sumero-Babylonian story, the woman plays the crucial role. She plays the civilizing role, for which she is not blamed, but rather honored, as appears later on in the story. And also, there are advantages to the civilized life, while there is also recognition of the price that was paid. And later on, when Enkidu dies, he has a flashback hallucination on his deathbed of regret and even cursing both the hunter and the woman who seduced him and abducted him out of the wilderness. But the gods say to him, no, you should not curse the hunter or the woman, because they brought you into the cities, and they brought you the friendship of Gilgamesh, and they brought you life and a house and much wealth and a wife and a family. And then he says, yes, you're right, I take back my curse. I honor the woman, he says later on his deathbed. Enkidu says, I honor the woman. She shall be honored by all. Old men will take off their hat to her. The young men will take off their pants to her. It says. inscribed in stone. Clay tablets. After a while of living in the city, Gilgamesh said to Enkidu, you and I should go out and to the great cedar forest and cut down some cedar trees, which we need to build more houses and walls, and kill the giant that lives in that forest, whose name is Humbaba, a great and terrific giant. And first Gilgamesh goes to Shamash, the sun god, and says, I want to do this. And the sun god says, why? And Gilgamesh says, because, and he says this to Enkidu too, because he is evil. Because he is evil, and we must rid the country of this evil. And Enkidu gets tears in his eyes and says, oh no, Gilgamesh, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're getting us into. This giant, that Humbaba that you want to kill, is a fierce and terrible and monstrous giant. He will wipe us both out. He will destroy us. You don't know that forest. I know it. I've been there. That forest is 10,000 leagues in every direction. It is huge. It is monstrous. We are in grave danger if we go there. And the gods have appointed that giant to guard that forest. That's the guardian of the forest. If we kill him, we will incur the wrath of the gods. And Gilgamesh said, don't worry. The two of us will do it together. We'll help each other. Don't be afraid. I'll help you. I'll protect you. You protect me. And together we can do it. That's what the hero always says, regardless of whether he's a man or a woman. This is a story told from the man's point of view, but please recall that it's equally true of the woman. The hero and the hera are the parallel people, the wild man, the wild woman. So they go, and they march many days to come to the forest. Before he goes, Gilgamesh has the people of the city make magnificent weapons for him, great swords, great clubs, great axes, great shields.